revelatory. But remember, what the new law says must be released includes things like investigative materials and maybe even Jeffrey Epstein's finances or other people that they were looking at that may not have been charged or necessarily associated with the actual case against Epstein, but it could be everything that the Justice Department took a look at. So we don't fully know what's in the files. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't revelatory, but this is now the third judge to say that all of this material must be released to...
Listen to those 15-year-olds. Listen to them call out what the state is doing to them, because this is where the whole bloody edifice cracks open, and what you're witnessing in real time is the most visceral demonstration of how governments weaponize the language of protection to advance an agenda of control, while literally erasing the voices of the very people they claim to safeguard. And I promise you this is only the beginning, because Australia's e-safety commissioner has said this is the first domino, and she's not even trying to hide it anymore. From December 10, 2025, age-restricted social media platforms will have to take reasonable steps to prevent Australians under the age of 16 from creating or keeping an account, and what we are watching unfold down under is nothing less than a pilot program for global digital censorship, dressed up in the respectable garments of child welfare, and you need to understand what is actually at stake here, because when Noah Jones says, as young Australians will be completely silenced and cut off from our country and the rest of the world, and we've just grown up with this our entire lives and now it's just being taken away from us all of a sudden. He is articulating something that neoliberal governments and their technocratic enablers fundamentally cannot tolerate, which is that an entire generation now possesses the communicative infrastructure to organize, resist, and speak truth to power without asking permission from the gatekeepers who have historically controlled the means of public discourse. Wait until you hear what Elon Musk said about this, because it gets even more revealing. Musk called it a backdoor way to control access to the internet by all Australians. And yes, I know we need to be extraordinarily careful about valorizing billionaire tech oligarchs who have their own authoritarian impulses, but even a broken clock twice daily, and the fact that the bill will require identity or age verification for all Australians to use social media, including adult, exposes what this has always been about, which is constructing the architecture of surveillance that can later be deployed for purposes far beyond protecting children. This is Foucault's disciplinary society, meeting Silicon Valley's biometric capitalism, and the children are simply the most politically expedient entry point, because who can argue against protecting kids without being painted as a monster? And that, my friends, is how authoritarianism always operates, by finding the one vulnerability in liberal democratic discourse where questioning becomes morally treasonous. A campaign group called the Digital Freedom Project launched proceedings in the High Court of Australia with two 15-year-olds, Noah Jones and Macy Nayland, as plaintiffs, and these teenagers are doing something extraordinary. They are asserting their constitutional rights in the face of a state that has decided their voices simply do not matter in the calculus of their own digital erasure. Let me take you deeper into the constitutional argument here, because this is where progressive legal theory collides beautifully with lived resistance, and the case will argue that the law is unconstitutional because it impermissibly burdens the implied freedom of political communication. And this matters enormously because the implied freedom of political communication arises from the Australian Constitution's requirement that parliamentarians be chosen by the people, and without freedom to communicate about political matters, that choice would not really be a meaningful one. Think about the profound democratic implications of this for just one moment. We are talking about systematically excluding an entire demographic from the primary forum of contemporary political discourse at precisely the moment when climate catastrophe, economic precarity, and rising authoritarianism will shape their entire adult lives, and then we have the absolute gall to lecture them about civic engagement and democratic participation when they turn 18. The hypocrisy is staggering, it truly is, and what these young people are arguing is that you cannot have a functioning democracy when you preemptively silence those who will inherit the consequences of today's political decisions. But here is where the plot thickens, and where you see the naked exercise of state power masquerading as benevolent paternalism, because Australian officials say the landmark ban is meant to protect children from addictive social media platforms that experts say can be disastrous for their mental health. And yes, there is genuine harm occurring online. No one with any intellectual honesty disputes that. But the solution being proposed is not to regulate the predatory business models of tech companies, not to mandate algorithmic transparency, not to require genuine data privacy protections. No. The solution is to remove children entirely from the digital public square and pretend that this constitutes protection rather than exclusion. UNICEF Australia believes the real fix should be improving social media safety, not just delaying access, and that right there is the entire game, because if you actually wanted to protect children, you would be dismantling the surveillance capitalism apparatus that targets them with algorithmically optimized manipulation. You would be going after the profit motives that incentivize engagement at any psychological cost, but instead what we get is a ban that leaves the entire extractive infrastructure intact, while simply removing one category of users who inconveniently lack political power. The teens themselves see right through this charade, and Noah Jones says we should be cutting off the bad things about social media, and warns that when kids do things in secret, that's when things can be really harmful, and this is exactly the point that critics have been making, that the platforms argue that young users may turn to new, unregulated apps that push them into darker corners of the internet. And we have seen this movie before. We have decades of research on prohibition models, showing that they drive behavior underground rather than eliminating it. They remove protective structures rather than creating safety. And yet here we are again pursuing the same failed logic, because the point was never really about safety in the first place. Digital Freedom Project President John Ruddick says kids are going to get around it, so they're then going to be on an underground social media, and to make it worse, without parental supervision. And while I have complicated feelings about libertarian framing, the substantive critique here is absolutely correct. Now pay attention, because this is where it gets properly Orwellian. Facebook, Instagram, Kik, Reddit, Snapchat, Threads, TikTok, Twitch, X and YouTube are required to take reasonable steps to prevent Australians under 16 from having accounts, but core services that eSafety considers do not currently meet the criteria include Discord, GitHub, Google Classroom, Lego Play, Messenger, Pinterest, Roblox, Steam and Steam Chat, WhatsApp and YouTube Kids. And do you see what is happening here? The state is now in the business of determining which platforms constitute legitimate spaces for youth participation, and which do not, carving out exceptions for services deemed educationally or commercially necessary, while banning the very platforms where contemporary political organizing and cultural production actually occur. This is not accidental. This is the deliberate construction of a segmented internet, where young people can be funneled into approved consumption channels, while being excluded from the participatory commons, where dissent and collective action take shape. The data that justifies this entire apparatus is worth interrogating, because the government says the social media ban is needed to protect the mental health and well-being of Australian children and teens, and they believe the risks of social media, such as cyberbullying, harmful content, and online predators, outweigh the positives. But here is what we also know: while many parents and even their children have welcomed the ban, others say it will hinder young people's ability to express themselves and connect with others, as well as access online support that is crucial for those from marginalized groups or living in isolated parts of rural Australia. This is the classic authoritarian move of treating populations as undifferentiated masses rather than complex subjects with vastly different needs and contexts. Because yes, for some young people, social media represents genuine psychological harm, but for queer kids in conservative households, it might represent the only safe space to explore identity. For Indigenous youth in remote communities, it might be the primary connection to cultural resources and organizing networks. For disabled teens, it might constitute the most accessible form of social participation available. The ban treats all of these contexts as equivalent, and in doing so it sacrifices the most vulnerable on the altar of a one-size-fits-all protection regime that privileges the concerns of relatively privileged suburban parents who have the resources to mediate their children's online lives. This is operating at a global scale now, and you need to understand the implications, because other governments from Europe to Asia are weighing similar moves, positioning Australia as a test case. The European Parliament passed a non-binding resolution in November, advocating a minimum age of 16 for social media access, allowing parental consent for 13 to 15-year-olds, while Malaysia and New Zealand have also been advancing proposals to ban social media for children under 16. Do you see the pattern emerging here? Do you see how this Australian experiment is being watched by every government that has struggled to contain youth climate activism, that has been threatened by student organizing around Palestine solidarity, that has found itself challenged by teenage girls demanding bodily autonomy, and suddenly there is a socially acceptable framework for excluding an entire generation from the primary infrastructure of contemporary political mobilization, and they are using child welfare as the Trojan horse. The enforcement mechanisms tell you everything you need to know about where this is headed, because tech companies that own these platforms could face fines of up to $50 million if they don't take reasonable steps to stop under 16s from having accounts, and it's up to the tech company to create systems to ensure those under 16 can't create or keep social media accounts. which means there won't be fines or penalties for young people and their families if they gain access, as the tech companies will face potential penalties instead. Now this sounds reasonable on the surface, right? We are not punishing the kids, we are holding corporations accountable. But think for 5 seconds about what this actually requires, which is the construction of comprehensive age verification systems that will necessarily involve biometric scanning, government ID checks, or invasive monitoring of online behavior patterns. These can include requiring users to submit an official document with proof of age, using biometric data to estimate a user's age through live video selfies, and reviewing online behavior like browsing history and social networks. Congratulations, we have just built the infrastructure for comprehensive digital identity systems that will be trivially easy to repurpose for surveillance of all users once the initial controversy dies down. And this is exactly what Musk was pointing to when he called it a backdoor for broader control. The clip mentions something absolutely crucial that we need to sit with, which is that Noah argues as young Australians will be completely silenced, and the word he uses is invisible, and this gets at something profound about contemporary citizenship and political subjectivity. In the 21st century, to be excluded from digital platforms is not simply to be denied a convenience, it is to be rendered systematically invisible in the public sphere where political discourse, cultural production, and collective identity formation now primarily occur. These teenagers understand something that many older commentators miss, which is that democracy is not simply a matter of formal voting rights that kick in at age 18, it is about the ongoing capacity to participate in the conversations that shape the conditions of collective life. When you systematically exclude young people from these conversations, when you deny them the ability to speak, organize, and contest the terms of political debate, you are not protecting them, you are disenfranchising them, and you are doing so at precisely the moment when they are developing the habits and capacities of political engagement that will determine whether they become active citizens or politically alienated subjects. We need to talk about the political economy of all this, because there is a reason this is happening now, and it comes amid rising suicide and self-harm rates among Gen Z Australian. And yes, this is real, and yes, it demands response, but let us be very clear about what is being obscured here, which is that an entire generation is coming of age under conditions of unprecedented precarity, inheriting a climate catastrophe that previous generations refused to address, locked out of housing markets and economic security that their parents took for granted, and told that their mental health crisis can be solved by removing their access to the one space where they can collectively articulate these structural failures and organize resistance to them. The Australian government under Labor has been systematically failing young people on climate policy, on housing affordability, on economic justice, and now they want to remove the infrastructure through which young people can call out these failures and build alternative forms of social organization. This is not conspiracy. This is the predictable behavior of a political class that would rather silence critique than address the material conditions generating that critique. Noah argues the ban will deny young people freedom of political communication and deprive them of an essential educational tool, asking, do you want 15-year-old boys to have no clue about consent? Do you want teenagers who don't know about the dangers of vaping? Both topics I've learned about on social media, and this is so important because it highlights how social media has become a primary site of peer education on topics that formal institutions have catastrophically failed to address. Schools do not provide comprehensive sexuality education. They do not honestly discuss drug harm reduction. They do not create space for critical discussions of power and justice. And young people have built alternative educational networks through social media that fill these gaps. When you ban under 16s from these platforms, you are not just removing entertainment, you are dismantling informal educational infrastructure that has emerged precisely because formal institutions have abdicated their responsibilities. The state's solution to its own failures in health education, sexuality education, and civic education is to prevent young people from educating each other, which is both darkly comic and deeply authoritarian. The comparison with other failed regulatory efforts is instructive here, because several under 16 users told ABC that they have been able to get around age verification or have not had their accounts removed, and one parent told ABC their 13-year-old son was able to pass the biometric face scan by hiding his teeth and scrunching up his face, and this perfectly illustrates the absurdity of the entire enterprise. Teenagers are extraordinarily resourceful at circumventing restrictions. They always have been. They have an entire developmental imperative driving them toward peer connection and autonomy, and the idea that you can technologically prevent this through facial scanning or ID checks is fantasy. What you will actually create is a system where privileged kids with tech-savvy parents and VPN access maintain their connections, while marginalized kids who most need access to support networks and organizing infrastructure are genuinely excluded, which means, like most prohibition regimes, this will end up reinforcing rather than alleviating existing inequalities. Digital Freedom Project President John Ruddick says the ban is grossly excessive and disproportionate, arguing it shifts parental responsibility onto the government and regulators. And while I am deeply skeptical of libertarian framing in general, there is something worth salvaging here about the appropriate distribution of responsibility for young people's online experiences. The move to governmental prohibition represents a massive transfer of authority from families and communities to the state, and it is worth asking who benefits from this transfer and what precedents it establishes, because once you have conceded that the state can determine which communication platforms are appropriate for which age groups, you have created a framework that can be expanded in countless directions. You can imagine future governments deciding that certain political content is inappropriate for people under 21, or that access to encrypted messaging requires verification of citizenship status. Then what looked like child protection becomes the foundation for comprehensive communication control. The international dimension is genuinely alarming, because Australia became the first country to enforce a nationwide under-16 social media ban. As global regulators watch closely, social psychologist Jonathan Haidt commended policymakers for freeing kids under 16 from the social media trap, and said the world is rooting for your success, and many other nations will follow. Now, Haidt has done important work documenting social media harms, but he fundamentally misunderstands the political stakes of these bans, which is that they create international precedent for youth exclusion from digital public spheres, at precisely the moment when young people globally are at the forefront of climate organizing, anti-war movements, feminist mobilizations, and democratic uprisings against authoritarian regimes. When you tell governments from Hungary to India to the Philippines that there is a socially acceptable framework for excluding young people from online political participation, you are handing them a gift-wrapped tool for demobilizing the very populations most likely to challenge their authority. The constitutional challenge is genuinely fascinating from a democratic theory perspective, because the case will argue that the law is unconstitutional because it impermissibly burdens the implied freedom of political communication. And this is drawing on a rich tradition of constitutional interpretation that recognizes political communication as foundational to democratic legitimacy. But here is where it gets interesting. The implied freedom of political communication is not an individual right, it is a structural requirement of democratic governance, which means the argument is not that these particular teenagers have a right to use Instagram, but rather that systematic exclusion of an entire age cohort from primary sites of political communication undermines the structural conditions necessary for democratic legitimacy. This is exactly the kind of sophisticated constitutional reasoning that progressive legal theory should embrace, because it moves beyond individualist rights discourse toward structural analysis of what democracy actually requires. Some of the skepticism about the constitutional challenge is revealing, though, because critics argue any reduction in political communication is slight, as very few 13, 14, or 15-year-olds use social media to create or engage with political content, and those who do are doing so only occasionally, and it is easier for governments to justify small burdens on political communication as proportionate. But this completely misses the point, which is that we are talking about the formative years when political consciousness and civic capacity develop, and excluding young people from the primary infrastructure of contemporary political life during these years has cumulative effects that cannot be captured by narrow analysis of current political engagement levels. You do not wait until someone is 18 and then hand them the franchise and expect them to magically become informed, engaged citizens. Political subjectivity is cultivated through years of participation, experimentation, and learning in political communities, and social media has become a crucial site where this cultivation occurs. The alternative pathways being suggested are worth examining because the Digital Freedom Project argues the law fails proportionality because less restrictive and workable alternatives exist. Parental consent pathways for 14 and 15-year-olds, platform duty of care and safe design settings, targeted moderation/takedown, age-appropriate feature gating rather than bans, digital literacy programs, and privacy-preserving age assurance, and every single one of these alternatives would be more effective at actually protecting young people while preserving their capacity for participation. A duty of care model that requires platforms to prioritize child safety and design, rather than maximizing engagement, would address root causes rather than symptoms. Digital literacy programs would give young people critical tools for navigating online spaces rather than simply excluding them. Privacy-preserving age assurance could allow graduated access based on demonstrated capacity rather than arbitrary age cutoffs. But none of these alternatives construct the surveillance infrastructure that governments actually want. None of them establish precedent for state control of digital access, and so they are dismissed as insufficiently protective, even though they would be more protective than a ban. The response from the government is telling because Communications Minister Wells said the center-left government would not be intimidated by legal challenges and that it remains steadfastly on the side of parents, and Minister Wells rejected the criticism in Parliament, saying we will not be intimidated by threats, legal challenges, we will not be intimidated by big tech. On behalf of Australian parents, we will stand firm. And this rhetoric is so instructive because it positions anyone who questions the ban as aligned with big tech against parents and children, which is an extraordinary discursive move that erases the actual young people bringing the challenge, that ignores the child welfare organizations raising concerns, that dismisses the constitutional questions as mere technicalities. This is authoritarian rhetoric dressed in progressive language, the claim to be protecting vulnerable populations as justification for refusing to engage with substantive critique or legal constraint. The global freedom of the internet context matters enormously here, because Freedom on the Net 2025 found that state responses to mass protests, deepening technical censorship, and threats to free speech in democracies fueled the 15th consecutive year of decline in internet freedom, and people in at least 57 of 72 countries were arrested or imprisoned for online expression on social, political, or religious topics. And this is the global environment in which Australia is pioneering new models of youth exclusion from digital spaces. When internet freedom is in global decline, when governments worldwide are finding new mechanisms to control online speech, to surveil populations, to punish dissent, the introduction of comprehensive age verification systems and youth bans on political platforms represents an escalation rather than an isolated policy choice. The authoritarian implications are obvious to anyone paying attention to global trends in digital rights. More than 1 million social media accounts held by users under 16 are set to be deactivated in Australia, in a divisive world-first ban that has inflamed a culture war. And that million accounts represents a million young people who will wake up to find themselves systematically excluded from spaces where their peers are organizing, creating, learning, and participating in public life. Think about the message this sends. Think about what it means to tell an entire cohort that their voices do not matter, that the state will determine when they are ready to participate in public discourse, that their concerns about their own futures can be safely ignored until they reach an age where the damage is already done. This is not protection. This is the systematic construction of political subalternity, and the fact that it is being pursued by a nominally center-left government under the banner of child welfare makes it even more insidious, because it neutralizes the very constituencies that would normally resist such measures. What makes this moment so dangerous is that it arrives amid genuine crisis. Prime Minister Albanese says, "This is the day when Australian families are taking back power from these big tech companies. They are asserting the right of kids to be kids, and for parents to have greater peace of mind." And there is real pain behind this rhetoric. There are real families struggling with the psychological impacts of social media. There are real harms occurring, but the solution being offered treats young people as objects to be protected, rather than subjects with agency and rights, and it constructs a framework where state power expands under the guise of family protection, in ways that will be extraordinarily difficult to roll back. Once you have built comprehensive identity verification systems, once you have established precedent for age-based exclusion from communication platforms, once you have normalized the idea that participation in digital public spheres is a privilege the state can revoke, you have created infrastructure that will be available for purposes far beyond protecting children from cyberbullying. The kids understand what is happening. Noah Jones says we're disappointed in a lazy government that blanket bans under 16s rather than investing in programs to help kids be safe on social media. They should protect kids with safeguards, not silence. And Macy Nayland says, if you personally think that kids shouldn't be on social media, stay off it yourself, but don't impose it on me and my peers. And this is exactly right. This is the kind of clear-sighted analysis that cuts through all the paternalistic rhetoric to identify what is actually happening, which is that the state has chosen the path of exclusion over the harder work of regulation, chosen surveillance over education, chosen prohibition over harm reduction. These teenagers are calling out laziness dressed as protection, authoritarianism dressed as care, and they are doing so with a sophistication that should embarrass every commentator treating them as objects rather than subjects of this policy. We are at a genuinely dangerous juncture where governments worldwide are looking for politically acceptable mechanisms to constrain online organizing and political speech, where youth movements represent one of the most potent challenges to established power across multiple issue area, and where child protection rhetoric provides cover for building the infrastructure of digital control. Australia is the test case, the proof of concept, and if this succeeds, if a social democratic government can successfully exclude an entire generation from digital public life while maintaining progressive credentials, then you will see this model replicated globally, with consequences we can barely imagine. The teens challenging this ban in court are not simply fighting for their own Instagram access. They are fighting a rearguard action against the normalization of youth disenfranchisement in the digital age, and everyone who cares about democracy, about free speech, about the rights of young people to participate in shaping their collective futures, should be paying attention to what happens in that courtroom, because the implications stretch far beyond Australia's borders and far beyond these particular platforms. This is about whether we will allow governments to construct the architecture of exclusion and surveillance under the banner of protection, whether we will accept that saving the children requires silencing them, and the answer to that question will shape the next generation of democratic possibilities worldwide.